Welcome today. I'm really excited to have Sara Peskin here. She is a professor of clinical neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's also an author and a writer and a mother and a million other things. And I feel like, I don't know, I kind of want to start with asking you a little bit about how did you go into medicine versus becoming a creative? Because your writing, you like especially your personal articles, your modern love piece was just stunning.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. I have to say the creative stuff came a lot later in time. So when I started off in college, I really wanted to start my own lab and do basic research. And then over time, I decided to start a program that's a combined MD PhD program. And I thought that mostly I was going to actually just go on and just do basic science and research. But then I loved medicine and then basically took a total left turn. And now I do clinical research visits, but I don't do any basic research at all. I don't lead any grants. Mostly what I do is see patients and then do writing. So it's not where I started off thinking that I would end up.
Well, I think like the one of the real strengths of the book is like it's formatted. I guess let's also take it one kind of step back a little bit. There was I think one point where you talked about transitioning. You originally started studying, wanting to have your own lab, but then kind of pivoting in the middle of your studies. And I think a lot of times for people, especially me, it's really difficult to make change, or like once you've committed to something, kind of rerouting. And I think that there was some research around that I feel like maybe it would be interesting for people to hear your story, or how you kind of made the choice to change.
Yeah, I remember feeling like that was a huge life choice to sort of quit an opportunity. That's what it felt like I was doing. Or it's like, if I just keep going another 3 years, I'll have a PhD. Wouldn't that be great? And then coming to terms with the idea that actually that degree wasn't useful for what I wanted to do. But because of the setting I was in, I was surrounded by other people who did want to do research, and realizing that my goals were different. Was hard. I remember actually the biggest thing was there's a TED talk that I watched, and it's this woman who basically talks about when decisions are particularly hard, oftentimes it means that both options are reasonable, and you may choose one option and find out the outcome isn't good, but you couldn't have known at the beginning. And I remember the feeling like that was so relieving, and feeling like, you know what, either decision is okay. And realizing it's okay to quit research. It was something that I think I didn't realize until I actually made the change, that it was the right decision. And then once I did, it's been great. I feel like now my days are filled with seeing patients that I love, and doing writing, which I also really love. And I don't think I would have enjoyed research the same. But at the same time, if I had made the opposite decision, maybe I would be just saying the opposite.
Yeah, it's so hard to know, but I mean, those changes, making those changes are so daunting. I think also it feels like almost a letdown, like you're letting down people or your mentors or people who have supported you. But in reality, I feel like those people really want you to be happy and you to be successful and do what you want. So it's kind of like it's a tricky thing we talk ourselves into.
Yeah, I really lucked out that the person whose lab I was working in, was amazing, and really saw me as a whole person, and not just someone who would further his career. And I remember it sort of took him by surprise, and he was very quickly, happy to say, look, it seems like this is the right decision for you, and I'll totally support you. And actually, when the book came out, I went over and brought a copy of the book to him, to just say, thank you for getting on the way to the place where I am now.
That's beautiful. What kind of got you interested in the brain itself? And do you have like a family history of medicine, people in your family practicing as well?
I have, in my parents' generation, they're essentially all doctors. So there's a lot of people in medicine, although no one in neurology or psychiatry. And I think when I was in med school, basically, so I quit my PhD and I went back to finish medical school, and I was sort of lost. I didn't really know what to do. And eventually I realized that the patients I really like seeing are ones that have essentially changes in personality. But I liked a little bit more of the sort of objective findings and data-driven stuff in neurology compared to psychiatry. But really, I think I'm most interested in these diseases that are diseases of the mind, but also really social diseases where you basically treat whole families. And what I do now, I see patients with common and rare types of dementia. And a lot of what I do is counseling patients and also counseling their partners and their children and sometimes their parents, and realizing how these diseases actually play out in real life, which is so much more complicated than just what you read about something on the page.
I think that that's true. I think that that was a main sort of takeaway that I got from the book, that it wasn't, we think about these things as personal ailments, but they're actually, I mean, the fact that they affect families, and also like the one person gets sick, it's not like the sadness or the sort of ambient loss is not still like surrounding that person. And so I think like having that sort of change in vantage point, I think was really helpful. But I kind of want to have you kind of start out at the beginning a little bit with, if you could define, just so I find that we're all on the same page, because I think a lot of people have different ideas of things. And I just wanted to kind of hear directly from you how you would define madness. And then I also want you to tell us what a molecule is.
So I define madness sort of loosely, really as just abrupt changes in personality and in cognitive ability. I think I wanted to try to be inclusive so I could get in examples of all the different diseases that I was interested in. And then a molecule, the best way to think about it is we've all heard of atoms like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. Anytime that there are two or more atoms stuck together, that's a molecule. So if you think of an atom as a Lego block, a molecule is basically any structure that you build with more than one Lego block.
So I think that, I mean, for me, like it was interesting, the like sort of immediate translation that my brain made, or associations with the title, is sort of, I mean, I know the subtitle is a brain hijacked, or Tales of the Hijacked Brain, I think. But like for me, it was just like really how close, I feel like I'm always stumbling around this like very, like my sanity is very sort of tenuous, I guess you could say. And I think having that sort of having the molecule away from madness, I think it illustrates that in a like a scientific way and less of a sort of feeling emotional kind of way. But I want to just kind of, the book is arranged into three, can we call these ailments, three different types of ailments, or three different types of,
Yeah, there are diseases that are caused by three different kinds of molecules.
and
But yeah,
I was wondering if I could have you talk about the three different kinds, but I mean, starting with their mutants, rebels, and
right. And I
evaders.
grouped invaders and evaders together. But yeah, so the mutants these are diseases that are caused by mutations in DNA. So we think of DNA as sort of the instructions for being who we are. And these diseases are conditions where people have mutations or in their DNA, so that the genetic code is altered, and it causes them to either lose their memory at an early age. It can cause them to have erratic behavior. It can cause them to have these writhing dance-like movements. And then the second chapter, the second section, is about what I called rebels, and these are proteins that are supposed to help us, and instead they take aim at the brain. So if you think about DNA as basically the instruction book, proteins are actually what you build from the code that's in the DNA. So proteins are the thing that really do the work of staying alive. Those are really the workhorses. And in particular, some of the conditions that I wrote about are conditions where the immune system actually attacks the brain. And then the last section was about invaders and evaders. If you think about DNA and protein, they're actually giant molecules. They're enormous. But we also have small molecules that are many, many, many times smaller than that. Something like water. We know it as H2O because it's two hydrogens as an oxygen. But there's lots of other small molecules that are, a little bit bigger than water, a few times as big as water. And they cause problems either when we have them and they're not supposed to be there, something like a medication that you take where it gets into the brain and causes personality changes or cognitive side effects, or the small molecules can cause a problem when they're supposed to be there and they're not there. So I call that evaders, when they're supposed to be there and they're not there, and invaders when we bring them into our bodies and that's what causes a problem.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. And then can we kind of talk about, so the story is written like a detective novel, and you have these sort of like instances of these detective stories for each of these sort of categories. And was there something, can we talk a little bit about the mutants? If there's a story from the mutant section that kind of you feel like resonated with people?
Yeah, so the story, I think that this is in my area of expertise, is about someone who I called the book Russell Goodman, and his dad Danny Goodman. And Danny Goodman he was a real innovator. He ended up in his 60s starting a wine company that became enormously successful. And he convinced his son, who at the time was studying microbiology, he convinced his son to join the family company selling wine. And so the son joins the company, and about 6 months later, he realizes his dad starts to change. Normally, his dad would give him a hug when he got to work, and he doesn't seem to be that interested in it. And phone calls will sort of hang in the air. His dad doesn't seem to be motivated to pick up the phone anymore. And he starts getting confused. He'll put, when they have listings for wine, he would pepper them with exclamation points. And so the website started to look totally off. And then the behavior got more and more egregious. He would eat tons of pizza, whereas he used to have a reasonable diet. He would order tons of DVDs. So his wife would notice there would be enormous amounts of DVDs popping out of the mailbox. And she started saying, "Why are you ordering all these?" And it got to be more egregious, where he was at work looking at pornography, and his computer faced the door. So there was nothing secretive about it. And he really had no insight that it was wrong. So these behaviors get more and more dramatic and farther from this character who was a loving, thoughtful, measured guy. And the guy he starts getting lots of advice from people who think, this is caused by ADD, or this is caused by chronic back pain. And ultimately, he ends up at a neurologist's office who says, I don't think that's what it is. This is a condition called frontotemporal dementia. It's a neurodegenerative condition. And it turned out he actually had a family history of people with somewhat similar symptoms. And they did genetic testing, and his disease was caused by a DNA mutation. So he had a mutation in his genetic code. He'd had this mutation his whole life. But for some reason, a reason we don't totally understand, in his 60s, it started causing him to have a complete overhaul of his personality into a person that his family, didn't recognize.
I mean, the implications of that are fascinating. And then also, so like having we think about our personality so much as our own. I guess at least my conception of my personality is that I have a certain amount of agency or control over it. And this sort of like really changes the narrative.
100%. I think there's also this idea that our personality is sort of fixed. Our body gets old, our vision goes away, but our personality is our selfhood, and that's our identity. And these are diseases where people lose their identity in some ways to these molecules,
which is crazy frightening. Can we talk a little bit?
Yeah, there's sort of two ways to think about it, I think. So there's, you could either say, this is so scary, look at all these ways that things can go wrong. But on the other side is, when we look around, most of us are actually doing okay. If we think about the average healthy 65-year-old, there's a 75% chance that they'll never have dementia. And some people say, oh my gosh, there's a 25% chance that they will. On the other hand, you could say most of the time, things actually go right. So these are really, some of these are rare cases where things go wrong. And it's kind of amazing that for the most part, we do okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference? Well, I appreciate that viewpoint. I'm definitely working on transitioning over to your viewpoint and less of on the, oh my gosh, there's so much can go wrong. I'm going to try to worry about all of it so I can be prepared, which makes no sense. But the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia, I feel like that's kind of a huge one, and it's in the is it in the mutants category?
Yeah, and I probably made it more confusing with the placement in the book. So this is the question that we get most of the time. That's the most common question we get in clinic. So dementia is a word that basically refers to how someone functions in the everyday world. So there's what's called normal, which is normal cognition. Someone's noticing some difficulty, things are a little bit harder. We can pick up some abnormalities is on their testing, which is like brain games, but they're basically doing everything they used to do. Dementia means that there are things they can't do because of memory and thinking problems, like they can't drive because they get lost and have to get picked up by the police. They can't cook because they leave the stove on too much. And it's usually referring to something that's generally neurodegenerative, something that's progressive. So dementia is about, what does it look like when someone goes about their life in the real world? Alzheimer's disease is actually just a description of what's going on at a microscopic level in the brain. So when I tell someone that I think they have Alzheimer's disease, what I'm really saying is, if I took out a piece of their brain and looked at it under a microscope, I think I would see buildup of two proteins. One is called amyloid and the other is called tau, but that's what defines the disease. And what's so neat about where we are now is you can have, we know that about 60 to 70% of cases of dementia are caused by Alzheimer's disease, but
A lot.
it's most of them. It's the most common cause of dementia. That being said, the remainder of cases of dementia, they don't have amyloid and tau in the person's brain. They're caused by some other microscopic problem. Maybe they're buildup of another protein called TDP-43 or another protein called alpha-synuclein. So there are people who have dementia, but they don't have Alzheimer's disease. And now we've actually gotten to the point where we're so good at detecting Alzheimer's disease, but we've identified people who have amyloid and tau accumulation in their brain. So they have Alzheimer's disease, but they're cognitively normal. They don't have dementia. They do testing. They do just as well as any person on cognitive testing. So there's a real disconnect. And what a lot of people are trying to do is to say, can we actually look at those people who have Alzheimer's disease but don't have dementia and figure out why are they so unique and what's going on?
Are there ways to sort of slow down the process of Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think there's some people sort of have a feeling of helplessness, like what can I do? And the reality is there are four things there are others, but there's really four big things that you have control over. The first one is exercise, and that there's just a huge amount of data for exercise, and people the data is reproducible over and over and over again. Most of the studies look at something like 30 to 40 minutes a day, 3 to 4 days a week of something aerobic. And it's been studied head to head. Aerobic stuff doesn't seem to help. So stretching doesn't have the same effect. It has to be something that you get your heart rate up. But that has a huge effect. And then diet-wise, the Mediterranean diet has the best data. But it's really hard to study diet. If I ask you what you ate yesterday, you probably have no idea. I can't tell you what I ate yesterday. And if I tell you to eat certain things, you probably won't listen. And the same for me. So it's really hard to study diet. But the Mediterranean one, for the most part, is the one that has the best data. And that's also the one that's great for preventing strokes and heart attacks. So it's all sort of together. And then social engagement actually has a great data. Going back to the 80s, there are studies that look at people, it's sort of counting the number of social connections that people have. And it turns out the more social connections you have, the slower your cognitive decline is.
Oh, so what do you think about, can you sort of, Sara, I think I lost.
For like, oh yeah.
Sorry, I think I lost you. Do you mind?
Sorry, I think my internet was a little unstable.
I
can hear you though.
Do you mind going back just like 10 seconds?
Let's see. Oh yeah. Go ahead. So I think we were talking about social engagement and how sort of the more points of contact you have, the slower people decline.
Yeah. Oh, I was just curious if you could sort of like rationalize why that might be.
I think it's really, if you think about the basic idea of neurons as sort of use it or lose it, social engagement is some of the most active things that you can do. You're having to respond to someone else in real time. You're observing visually, you're observing your auditory system is getting input, your emotional system is getting input. So it's really engaging socially is a highly active process. So it makes sense that would keep people sort of younger. I also think we know that untreated depression has an association with cognitive decline, and socialization and combating isolation we know helps with depression.
Just oddly anecdotally, can you speak to at all your experience of treating patients or not after, because we're not over this pandemic, but I mean, during the pandemic, how has the pandemic sort of affected people's orientation or understanding of themselves or neurochemistry, do you think?
Yeah, the pandemic was tough for our patients, and it was hard for our patients. It was almost harder for their caregivers. There was just so much isolation, and these diseases that we see, Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body disease, they are difficult for patients, and they are incredibly isolating for caregivers and for partners. So these spouses who are watching their partner slowly deteriorate, it's extraordinarily isolating. And our caregivers struggled with it. It just, all of the adult day centers that people went to, for the most part, all closed down. People worried about having caregivers in the home. And it was really difficult. And now things are really, for the most part, much more opened up, and there's been a lot of relief. So we're sort of crawling back from where we were. But it was horrible. The other thing that came up often in some of the diseases where people are disinhibited, mask wearing was really difficult, because people would go out and they would say, look, I can't go to the grocery store because my husband pulls down everyone else's mask. And so it was just sort of a learning process to start to figure out, how do you teach people to care for loved ones with these diseases, basically in isolation. It's not how we're supposed to do it, and it's not good for any of us.
Can you talk a little bit about the next session? Maybe give an example of a rebel.
So the rebels were they were diseases that are caused by proteins, and so one of the diseases that I talk about happens to a young woman who she'd grown up in sort of adverse circumstances. Exactly, this is Lauren Kane. So she grew up in adverse circumstances, was actually incredibly successful academically. Her mom was extremely supportive, and she went off to a elite school, comes home after graduating college, and starts watching The Walking Dead, and she's sort of binge watching it. And she wakes up one morning that summer and starts repeating the same question over and over again. And her mom's thinking that's a little bit unusual. And she eventually develops a fever. She gets unsteady on her feet, and her mom takes her to the emergency room, and she becomes acutely psychotic. And she starts calling people by names of characters in the show. And actually, one of the guards in the emergency room, who had been called to keep her safe, is the one who figures out that she is basically stuck in The Walking Dead, that she seems to think that she's living in the show. And so she gets admitted to the hospital. No one can really figure out what's going on. And her mom reads an article about a disease that causes young women to become acutely psychotic. And she brings it up to the medical team, and they sort of reject it. The way that her mom described it to me is that they said, sort of poo-poo, you're just a mom. And they do all their tests, but they can't figure out what's going on. And finally, she says, won't you just look at this disease? And they eventually transfer her to another hospital, where they immediately send off the test for that disease. And her mom is right, and that's the right diagnosis. And the condition is actually caused by an autoimmune problem. Lauren Kane, the woman in the story, actually had a tumor that had been growing on her ovary. And the tumor itself was not a problem. It wasn't that big. It's not like it was pressing on anything, but it has this wild characteristic where it can essentially masquerade as other parts of the body. The cells look like other parts of the body, and sometimes they can look like neurons. And so her immune system wanted to attack the tumor, made this protein, this antibody, to attack the tumor, but actually it also attacked proteins in the brain. And that's what caused her to become psychotic. It basically works like PCP in terms of the mechanism. So if you think of when someone uses PCP, they have these changes in cognition, and then the drug wears off and it goes away. For Lauren Kane, it was almost like she was hooked up to a drip of PCP. But when they figured out what was causing the disease, there are treatments, and it's essentially a curable disease. And so she was treated, and she was essentially cured. She still follows, but she's done really well because her mom basically pushed the medical team to figure out what was going on.
I think that was really an inspiring story, both in, well, I mean, frustrating in some ways that like you can advocate for someone, but I feel like she would, and not be heard, but then eventually her sort of persistence won out in the end. I guess I don't know how to say that in a way that makes sense, but like it's interesting to me to think about what's your thoughts on kind of ordinary people because I think it's hard now with all of this access to information, actually understanding it and using it, not as a medical professional. I think for me, I try really hard not to Google things because there's danger when that happens. But also I want to be informed and I want to try to understand the best I can. What would you recommend? Do you have any recommendations in terms of what should do people, is it a good idea to
What should we do and what should, yeah.
should we be Googling these things?
No, I think it's a great question. I think the reality is it should be somewhat of a collaborative experience with physicians. And I can tell you, I tried to be more open to patient suggestions ever since hearing this story and talking to Lauren Kane and her mom. And I can tell you, just in the last year and a half, I've had 2 patients where their family members diagnosed them, and I wouldn't have gotten the diagnosis if not for the family members. One of them, I saw the patient, I wasn't sure what was going on, and his wife sent me a message saying, do you think this could be it? And I looked it up and I was like, that sounds exactly right. Let's do the testing. That was it. And he's being treated. And then I had another patient who her sister came in and said, do you think it could be this? And I said, no, I don't think that's what it is. I did all of the tests that I wanted to do, couldn't find the answer. And she brought it up again and said, I know we talked about this, but do you think this could be it? And at that point I realized, actually, I think she was right all along. And we're now trying to actually pursue that diagnosis. And so I think it is important for doctors to be open to these. At the same time, on the other side, there has to be some recognition of, I've brought this concern up to the doctor, they have some training and they can speak to it. And, they're better than Dr. Google. And there can be a conversation, but ultimately, I think there has to be a sense of feeling like there is respect for medical training over Googling. But I do think, it's always good, I think, when you have questions about, could it be a problem with this? It's always good to ask your physician, and they should be open to it.
I think the collaborative process of medicine is really sort of exciting and hopeful for me for the future, because I do think there's so many things that you do know as a mother or a patient or a relative that might not be visible to the physician who doesn't see you all the time. There was something I think you had written about how it's really important if you are going to get diagnosed or you are seeing someone that you bring a family member. Can you talk a little bit about the role of how we understand our mental states versus what actually might be going on?
Yeah, so there's often, especially in the diseases that we see, there's often a disconnect. So a big part of Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and other conditions like that is that the people who have them often don't realize that they have a problem. And so, we frequently have people who come in and say, oh, yeah, I have no memory problem. And then you talk to their partner and you realize they actually are having significant difficulty with memory, but they're not aware of it. And the reality is that's sort of true, not just in neurodegenerative conditions, but also in everyday life. The way that we think we're perceived is actually pretty different than how we really are. I remember thinking, this is probably TMI. I met my husband online, and I remember, many years ago having my online profile and looking at it with friends and then saying, oh no, that's a flattering picture. Oh no, that's not a flattering picture. And realizing, oh my gosh, I had chosen terribly. So this idea of being not great judges of our own capacity for cognition or for thinking and memory, I think exists even outside of neurodegenerative conditions.
I couldn't agree fully. I couldn't agree more. I think it's really difficult to understand. There's so many levels to self-understanding and self. I feel like right now that we're living in this time period where everybody's talking about being self-aware and the importance of being self-aware. And I'm not entirely sure if that's possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I can tell you when, for all of our visits, we ask someone to bring someone else that knows them well. And it's pretty amazing to see. And actually, when people bring a different person from time to time, you get a different perspective. So it is pretty wild to see how people can be in the same situations and perceive it in completely different ways.
I'm going to tangentially expand on that by saying that I don't know how people will feel about this, and potentially maybe you might really disagree with this, but I think that should be expanded into most medical settings. I just think that there's different ways that we advocate for ourselves versus other people, and also different understandings that I think could also be sort of widely applied to different illnesses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's I think I've read studies that people only absorb like 10% of what they actually hear in a doctor's office.
That I don't.
And so from my perspective, people really should be bringing someone else to every appointment, essentially.
I
Um,
don't know what people did before after visit summaries, or I don't know what I did before. Well, I was younger and like my
yeah.
memory worked a bit more. I mean, things stuck a little bit more, but like after visit summaries, I have to remember them several times all the time. I want to talk
They're
about
huge. Although, but then you're dependent on having a doctor that actually, does a good job on them.
maybe I'm just lucky. I've had really good. I don't know. I really love our care team, so I guess maybe yeah, no, I am dependent on a doctor that does a good job on my after visit summaries. Can we talk about the last section? Can you give examples of the invaders and evaders? Just because we're running out of time.
Oh,
And
sorry.
I could ask you,
Um,
there's so many other questions I want to ask you, but
So the evaders and invaders, these are small molecules that cause problems either when they're there and they're not supposed to be, or they're not there and we're supposed to have them. And so one story about it is there was this condition called pellagra, and this is a condition that we don't really see anymore in the U.S. And it causes we learn about it as the 3 Ds, as diarrhea, dermatitis, which is a rash, and dementia. And for the most part, people used to think it really only existed in Europe and in Africa. And people thought that the US was basically immune to the condition. But in the early 1900s, people started realizing that pellagra existed in the US, and it primarily affected people who were impoverished. There was this idea that it was caused by an infection that was transmitted by flies. And that was sort of comfortable for people because they could say, look, it's poor people, they have poor sanitation, and the diseases, they're causing their own disease. And so no one did that much about it, but the disease got more and more common, and it's affecting, tens of thousands of people, and then hundreds of thousands of people. And then people across the United States start wondering about, is this going to affect me too? And newspapers start publishing stories about the disease basically causing panic. And so finally, the Surgeon General calls on this guy, Joseph Goldberger, who is a public health officer. And he says, Dr. Goldberger, can you solve pellagra? Can you figure it out? And Goldberger, he had done an enormous amount of work before on public health issues, and he'd basically gone around contracting a lot of the diseases that he studied. So he'd gotten typhus and typhoid and yellow fever before, and he decides he's going to take on pellagra, knowing full well that he may end up with this disease. And he starts off at the library, which is where he starts off with most of his projects, and he starts reading through conferences that have been done on pellagra. And he very quickly realizes that the problem, there's a problem with the idea of pellagra being caused by an infection. And this is the problem. So all these people with pellagra are being cared for in institutions and, in orphanages and hospitals. And the people who care for them don't develop the disease. So if the disease was caused by infections that were transmitted by flies, all of these people are getting bitten by the same flies, but they're not all developing the disease. So there has to be something else going on. And Goldberger rightly realizes that the disease is actually caused by a deficiency in the diet. And he goes on to do some sort of stomach churning experiments that I talk about in the book, but I won't subject you to. And he ultimately proves that it is caused by a deficiency in the diet. But there's a lot of resistance at the beginning because the optics are totally different. Now, instead of saying, look, poor people have bad sanitation and they're causing their own disease, we're now saying the country is starving its own people. But eventually he convinces people of his idea, and he figures out that the disease is caused by a deficiency in a B vitamin. And he dies before people figure out exactly he figures out exactly which B vitamin it is. And they ultimately go on to figure out that it's a deficiency in vitamin B3, which is called nicotinic acid. So they start putting nicotinic acid in flour to fortify it. And they get these headlines that says tobacco in your bread because people think that it's nicotine. And so they convene a meeting with bakers and marketers, and they decide they're going to rename vitamin B3, and they rename it niacin. And so that's where the history of niacin comes from. And we see it in the in the drugstore all the time, but that's the history behind it.
Can you mention a little bit about the rice?
Oh, so the rice experiments was actually from this is from a disease that we talk about as Korsakoff syndrome, and it was mostly defined by this guy, Sergei Korsakov. He was a neuropsychiatrist in the 1800s, and he met some patients who had a history of alcoholism. And they had this wild symptom called confabulation, where they would, and they also had very poor memory. So they basically couldn't make any new memories. And they would sort of essentially fill in gaps in memory with these wild stories. And it would be not on purpose. So they called them sort of honest liars. So they would come up with these wild stories of things. Yeah, it was these stories of things that never happened, but they have no idea that it never happened. It just pops out of their memory. They're basically, their memory becomes a source for creating facts rather than, depositing them. And so this disease gets defined, but no one can figure out what's causing it. And it also causes a weakness. And so ultimately, it became really common among Dutch soldiers. And so this guy started researching the disease. He thought it was caused by a toxin. And so he's trying to find, what toxin is causing this disease. He thought maybe alcohol had a toxic substance that caused people to get weak and confabulate and lose their memories. And while he's doing his research, there's a bunch of chickens that are kept in a coop next to his research lab. And he starts realizing that the chickens start developing this disease that looks like this disease that humans are developing, where they get really weak and then they can't breathe and they die. And this scientist was so good at looking up from his desk and realizing the solution might be somewhere else. And he realizes the birds are actually a great model for the disease that he's studying. And then after a few weeks, the birds basically just get better on their own, and he can't figure out what happened. And so he goes and he talks to the lab keeper who's been feeding the birds. And he says basically that there's a chef in the kitchen. I was on a military base, and there's been a chef in the kitchen who for a while they decided that instead of giving the birds white rice, or instead of giving the birds brown rice, which was considered worse, they're going to give them white rice. And that's when the birds developed disease. And then another chef came up and said, oh no, you can't give them the fancy white rice. You have to go back to giving them brown rice. And then the birds get better. And it turns out that when you polish brown rice into white rice, when you get rid of that shell, you lose the vitamin B1. And so this whole disease is caused by a deficiency in vitamin B1, or which is also known as thiamine. And so these birds, when they suddenly were switched to white rice, they didn't get enough vitamin B1, they got the disease. And then back to brown rice, now suddenly they're healthy. And so this researcher actually started a program and gave people all over throughout the Dutch prisons, they actually switched to giving them brown rice instead of white rice, and the disease disappeared. So it was a pretty impressive feat of research, and kind of a weird finding. I don't think I ever realized the difference between brown rice or white rice until I actually started researching it for the book.
Oh no, I didn't at all until this book. I mean, you hear that brown rice is healthier.
Right. There's this idea that it's healthier. Right. I had no clue. I don't think I even realized that you would polish white rice or brown rice into white. I didn't realize that that's how it worked.
I think that this is reason enough for me to eat brown rice. I feel like I never really understood the exact reason, but I feel like this is it. It also like really emphasizes how much of a role diet plays, I feel like, in our mental health, and having just that one seemingly small sort of detail change could make a huge difference.
Throw things off.
I think it also points to the sort of the hopefulness that is embedded throughout this book, even though there are lots of conditions that don't have a cure, but there are all like finding out, I guess, all of these things like throughout, even just so recent, that we can do to kind of help ward off dementia or different cognitive decline earlier in life. I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about, it seems like there are several times in this conversation that you have taken sort of a glass half full or a hopeful sort of interpretation of the data. Can you talk a little bit about why you made the choice if that's just sort of like innately who you are and your perspective, or if there's some intention behind it?
I guess I feel hopeful about the patients that I see, because I think like we are far. I mean, this is ridiculous to say, but sort of you could say we're farther than we've ever been before. But the things that we could do with these patients, even though for a lot of the diseases we don't have cures, for some of them we do have cures. Most of the conditions I wrote about in the book actually are treatable or curable. And even for the ones that aren't, for some of the diseases that are caused by DNA mutations, we have the technology now for people to have children that don't have the DNA mutations that they have. You could basically root out a DNA mutation from your own lineage, which is amazing. Common, they have a disease before. We found out that it's caused, we find out that it's caused by a DNA mutation. Oftentimes, many of them have kids who are about to have their own children. And instead of typical processes of conception, they do IVF, and basically you merge a sperm and egg in the lab. The cells sort of divide and grow into a ball of cells. You take away one of those cells and you look and see if it has a mutation. And if it does, you don't use that embryo. And if it doesn't, you put that embryo back into the uterus and it grows into a baby that does not have the mutation. And it's amazing. We can actually, we can root out mutations from people's lineages. So I feel like things like that make me feel really hopeful. We've done these incredible things. And I also think there is still a lot of joy after these diagnoses. And I think some people have this idea that if you get some of these diagnoses, there is nothing left in life. And the reality is that that's not at all. Yeah, but it's not the case. There are, people have all sorts of medical issues. And a lot of it is about figuring out, how do you figure out what do you enjoy, and how can you figure out a way to do the things that you enjoy despite the difficulties that you're having. So if you have bad memory, but you love, you love whatever it is, you love, Sudoku, you love, socializing, you love reading books, then maybe instead of reading a full-length book, you read, short stories, or you read magazines. You just have to, we have to find ways for people to still find joy despite all of it. And also realizing that these are all of these conditions are moving targets, and what people can do, the way that they find joy today may not work next month, or may not work a year from now. But there still have to be ways.
So there are, again, we're totally out of time, but I really appreciate you going longer, Sara, with me. Can you talk?
Yeah, this is so neat.
Really briefly about, I really want you to talk a little bit about the intersections between your clinical process and your creative process. And then I also really want to end on kind of your hopes for the future, what you're working on that you're excited about.
Yeah. When I first started writing, actually, it was totally separate from my clinical work. So most of the early stuff that was sort of the modern love piece and other sort of memoir type pieces. And then over time, I sort of moved over to realizing that I wanted to learn how to communicate science and neurology and medicine to people who don't necessarily have a science background. Right, so you're the target audience, and so ultimately, I think a lot of people have things that they do other than seeing patients. Some people do research. I don't apply for grants. I don't spend my time on that. What I spend my time on is writing, and it's like it's the perfect complement to seeing patients. And actually, I think there are studies on this, that having something else other than clinical medicine is actually really good for preventing burnout. And the reality is they're really complementary skills. When I see a patient in clinic and I write a note, really what I'm trying to do is take the story that they've given me and distill it into something that's coherent and has a structured narrative and leads up to a point that I want to make, which is, I think the diagnosis is X. And that's the same thing that you do when you write. You're basically trying to figure out, how do you encapsulate an experience into narrative that's approachable and understandable? And how do you lead someone to whatever point you want to make in the end? So it's actually the same skill set. So I think it's been great. Anyway, structurally during the week, I see patients all day Tuesday and Wednesday. I have meetings on Monday, meetings and research visits on Thursday, and then I write on Friday. And that's the perfect balance. It's not like sort of spurts. It's really every week there is some time to do that creative process of writing, and that's worked out great.
I think yeah,
I can't remember the second question now. Sorry.
Oh no. I guess what are the sort of hopes you have, if any, for the future in terms of maybe research or cures, and then also maybe what you're excited about personally?
I think the biggest, I mean, the holy grail is finding a cure for Alzheimer's disease. It's the most common cause of dementia. It affects millions and millions of people. And looking at the statistics, it's going to be a huge burden. I think by 2050, it's like going to triple or something like that. So that's the holy grail. And we're better than ever at detecting Alzheimer's disease. And there's a particular approach to trying to treat it that's been under study for a long time. And we're getting close to figuring out whether that approach works or doesn't. And if it doesn't work, we're going to turn to other approaches. But I think that's sort of the biggest thing on the horizon to conquer. And then personally, I have ideas for sort of what to write next. Sometimes I sort of want to write a children's book, although all the adult authors that I know who go to write books, I think they get better than they expect. But part of me really wants to write a kid's book next.
Oh,
and then I have for an adult book, I have thoughts of writing about sort of history of neuroscience, starting off with, how did we figure out that the brain is the organ that thinks? Because we used to think it was the heart. To within the brain, how do you figure out what part does what? And then going to modern times where we realize everything's actually connected.
Yeah, no, I think it's sort of over the past 10 years, it's been a real feat to try to reconceptualize the difference between the mind and body. Or like thinking about them as separate, then this paradigm, or that everything is interconnected. Sara, thank you so much for taking the time out. Thank you for a molecule away from madness. It was just a delight to read. It read, again, like super easy, but then it really distilled these very complex understandings of science and how we come to know things, and then the interaction between scientists and doctors, just fascinating. I vote you write a children's book, but I also vote you write a memoir. I think your stories on love and also I think you've written quite recently about dying quite a bit and death. And I think you're just a phenomenal writer. And I really liked the way that you talked about your creative process being really parallel to how to kind of communication and sharing stories, and ultimately like placing ourselves and understanding where we are at as humans and relating to each other. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so nice. It was so great to talk to you.
You too. Take care.